We are now recording, and a recording of today's talk will be posted on the St. John's YouTube channel. I'm happy to share it with you, Andrew, to post at Pine Street if you wish.
Thank you. Great.
And I would like to ask you, I'm Susan Springer of St. John's Episcopal Church in Boulder. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have folks from Pine Street Church here as well, and the Reverend Andrew Doherty. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment. Andrew, would you mind opening us with prayer, please?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. Let us lift up our hearts to the Lord. God of our present, God of this moment, and God of this conversation, we give you the deepest devotion and thanks of our hearts for this gathering of our congregations. We give you thanks for the ministry and witness of St. John's Episcopal and of Pine Street Church. We give you thanks for all gathered here today, O God, as we seek to continue to learn and discern the ways in which your Spirit is among us and present and active. We give you thanks for Stephen Hawkins this day and all that is burning and churning in our minds and hearts as we ready ourselves for presidential election too. Grant us peace, grant us courage and wisdom for the living of these days. And may this conversation and learning today lead us to action. In the name of the one who was and is to come, Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome, Stephen. Stephen Hawkins, the Director of Research for moreincommon.com, is our speaker today. I want to offer a bio, just a short personal word, and then Stephen, I shall turn it over to you. Before I get started, we will record the talk. When Stephen is done, let me know. I will stop the recording, and then we will do Q&A or discussion. Stephen will, however you would like us to lead that, we shall. What we've been doing is folks just raise their hand, I record who they are, and we just talk in order. So if that meets with your approval, we shall do that. And then when you are done, just cry enough, and we will bring this gathering to a close. Stephen, as I said, is the Director of Research for moreincommon.com. This is an organization that studies to understand and address political polarization in the United States, in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. His reports with More in Common have been referenced in over 700 media articles, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, CNN, Fox News, and The Atlantic. Stephen has appeared on NPR, The Ben Shapiro Show, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and has spoken at the United Nations General Assembly. And Stephen, now you can add St. John's Episcopal Church on Pine Street Church to this illustrious group.
Right after the
prior to More in Common, Stephen advised on public opinion strategies for Fortune 100 companies, such as Microsoft and Ford, and public sector organizations, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UN Refugee Agency. He received his master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and is curious about how beliefs define people's experiences of the world. Stephen lives in Denver with his fiancée, which is pretty cool because this is an international organization. So when I became familiar with Stephen's work, I was delighted to find that we were in the same time zone. That has made this so much easier. He enjoys snowboarding in the Rocky Mountains and performing impersonations of American political figures. I didn't know that. maybe we need one of those before we part today. I ran across Stephen's work when I was researching for one of my Facebook live streams. His work and his organization's work on tribalism in American society really caught my attention, and I referenced it. There are 3 studies that Stephen's organization is either undertaking right now or is about to undertake or has just completed. One is a 7-country study on the impacts of COVID-19 on trust, social cohesion, democracy, and expectations for an uncertain future. The other 2 studies are ones I think he will speak with us about: the American Fabric Study or Project and the Election Integrity Project. And Stephen, you are asking the questions. You are putting words to the questions I think that are on all of our hearts. So I thank you for the work that you do. Welcome. I shall turn this to you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate the invitation. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you all today. I hope I can make it worthwhile. For my job, I give presentations about polarization and public opinion every day, but it's really fitting that this conversation would actually take place in a setting much more like this one, in a context of community, in a context of faith and morality and conversations of responsibility. And in some ways, I feel that the presentations that I give at my job are missing that component. And so it's a welcome opportunity for me to be able to speak with you about the things that I've been learning as a student of these critical subjects of polarization and on race. It's also fitting that we'd have this conversation today, which, as many of you may know, is Yom Kippur. My fiance, who's joining us today, is Jewish, and through her I've learned about this specific tradition and very old and ancient Jewish tradition of reflection and forgiveness and pondering the year that's gone by and considering the year that's ahead. And it's very much in that spirit also that I hope to give my comments today and that we might dwell on them. This is also just a little unusual for me. I'll be honest, I'm sitting in an empty office. I've got a laptop stacked on books. So if I seem a little off balance at some point, I just ask for a little bit of grace and hopefully we'll get back on track. Also, hopefully the sun doesn't set too soon and the lighting will continue to persist. But as Andrew explained or mentioned in his prayer, we are in a very heavy context in this country. It's an overwhelming context at times. We're experiencing an economic slump during a once-in-a-century pandemic, having a once-a-generation racial justice movement in a deeply polarized society with a vicious Supreme Court justice battle in progress and in a presidential election year. And as a parenthetical note, if you're a Denver Nuggets fan like me, it's a particularly rough day. Denver's eliminated from the playoffs, and that just put a particular point on it for me here today. But jokes aside, Americans are overwhelmingly worried about our division. It's rare to see so much alignment on key questions. I'm a pollster. I ask people questions every day, and getting above 90% either means you've asked too easy of a question or something is very dramatically happening in the country. And it's the second case when it comes to asking about division in the country today. Overwhelmingly, Americans recognize that we're divided. They recognize that that division is political in nature, much more than it is generational or even racial. And they're overwhelmingly worried about the election. Right now, the election is right up at the top of people's priorities in this country, next to healthcare as the #1 issue. And sadly, we're overwhelmingly bracing for a difficult November with anticipations of there being foreign interference in the social media, perhaps some foreign coordination with the campaigns, and expecting that there will be a lot of turmoil in November as we wait for 2, 3, or even more weeks for the result to emerge. And so it's in that context that I want to provide some thoughts on polarization and on specifically on the psychology of what's happening in our country. But I recognize that one of the things that's true, and if you're engaged in talking to people about their opinions every day like I am, nobody thinks that their view on this question is wrong. And I am, like the rest of the country, convinced that my views are correct. And so I want to step away from my own personal perspective as much as I can here, because this is a challenging subject, because if we were talking about the rise of China, or if we were talking about, I don't know, if we were talking about a subject about physics, I would be divorced or detached from that subject. But that's not the case here. We're talking about American identity, and I'm an American. We're talking about our democracy, and I'm a voter and a donor. We're talking about race, and I have a race. And so when we talk about our democracy, I'm emotionally invested in it. And when we talk about race and privilege and prejudice and bias, I'm implicated in that situation. And when we talk about polarization, a subject about which I write and speak and present, I'm actually integrated into that subject. And so while I'm very intentionally, perhaps even to an uncomfortable extent, going to try and divorce my own perspective here and draw heavily from the things that I can offer here. And those are that I can be data oriented. So over the past 2 to 3 years, we've conducted over 20,000 interviews with people through online surveys and through other types of focus groups and discussions. I lead a project called Hidden Tribes Live, which is an online platform where we have 100 Americans every day log in, and they upload videos about things that they're thinking. They answer questions, they engage with each other. And so I hope that I can use some of that data orientation to guide this conversation in a way that is objective. The second is actually a little bit more personal, and that's that I could be described as maybe being ideologically or politically transient as a person. In my adult life, I have spent a lot of time on the conservative Republican side of the aisle. I attended CPAC, the famous conservative political action conference that happens annually, and gave John McCain a pat on the back on the day that he became the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party in 2008. I've worked on Capitol Hill as an intern for a Republican congressman from Georgia who got into a lot of controversy over his comments about newly elected President Barack Obama. And more recently, I've been involved on the side of things that are more liberal and progressive and democratic. I worked for an LGBT-run campaigning organization based in Manhattan that was one of the leading organizations that steered the Women's March in response to President Trump's inauguration. I've worked with groups, as Susan mentioned at the top of the call, like the Sierra Club and the UN Refugee Agency. And so from that life experience, I'm trying to draw from both beliefs that I have held and perspectives that I've held on that journey and in those different places, and also from relationships that I've built in both contexts and everywhere in between that have helped me to understand why we're divided, how our perspectives differ, and what we might do about it. So I'm going to break this talk into 3 pieces, and the first part is about polarization, the biggest contextual backdrop that we're operating within. I want to talk a little bit about some of the causes there, some of the implications of that. And then I want to focus in on the subject matter of race, which I think is really the running theme for this series of talks that Susan and Andrew are leading. And finally, I want to conclude on bringing it home to us as individuals and what we might do to address these problems and be a part of a solution and building a world that looks different from the one that we're in today. So, going back to late 2017, I was involved in a project that had no real auspicious beginning, let's just say. We were motivated, me and a small group of people, just 3 or 4 of us, to try and understand what was going on with the polarization in Western societies. We started in France and in Germany. And when we began our research here in the United States, we had 1 employee, and it wasn't me, I was just a contractor. We had no office, and we had published nothing in the United States. And so in October of 2018, when we released our first report, Hidden Tribes, a study of our polarized landscape, of America's polarized landscape rather, we didn't know what to expect. And the day after we released it, I got a phone call. It was for an interview, which I thought it was exciting. And then I learned that the journalist was actually just a student at a community college who was doing the interview as a homework assignment. And I thought, well, that'll be it. I've worked on this project for over a year. We did 8,000 interviews, put in hundreds of hours. Mickey can attest that it cost me many nights of sleep. And I thought that was it. And fortunately, it wasn't. A few days later, David Brooks dedicated his Sunday column to relaying the findings of our report and explaining how he perceived them. It was then picked up by the Financial Times and the Atlantic, and ultimately was referenced over 800 times in the media, and subsequently featured on the front page of the New York Times. And in the year that followed, it was referenced, and this terminology was used by presidential candidates from both political parties. It led to invitations to speak on a stage that I shared with heads of state, presidents and prime ministers in Iceland, to have a meeting with the French ambassador in Washington, D.C., to be interviewed by the BBC at the United Nations at its annual largest convening in New York. And actually, I don't think that the reason that this report had such an effect was because we explained something that nobody knew, but rather actually because I think we were able to articulate some things that actually kind of everybody knows. And so I want to talk about just 3 key findings that came out of this report that really got taken up by the media and by other organizations. So the first is that when we think about the division in our country, it's tempting to think about it in terms of 2 sides. We have a 2-party system in our country. And so really it can very easily seem like we have Republicans and Democrats, and the division is between Republicans and Democrats. That's in fact not what we find. We find that there are meaningful differences, a wide range of diversity and political viewpoints that spans what really should be described as more like 7 groups, including a large group that's politically disengaged, but also folks who are more moderate and who don't particularly feel a strong emotional or ideological attachment to one of the parties. Meaningfully, what we found was that there was a group we could call the exhausted majority. If you see the exhausted majority come up in the press and the talk, this was the first time this idea was introduced into the conversation. And that exhausted majority we describe as referring to about 2/3 of Americans, really a majority of people. And what characterizes the exhausted majority is feeling forgotten by the political process because the perspectives represented maybe by the cable news channels don't particularly resonate, or they feel heavy-handed. And the exhausted majority is also characterized by feeling really fed up and frustrated with the degree of political conflict in our country, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's on Congress. They feel frustrated that there's not more compromise and success, and that there's not more progress being made on major issues. And meaningfully, the exhausted majority doesn't think in just one way. The members of this group, some vote Democrat, some vote Republican, a lot of them don't vote at all, but they don't have a very predictable set of opinions that consistently line up with everyone in their group. The second finding that really registered was that we found that 4 out of 5 Americans think that there is a problem with political correctness in our country. And this was a very controversial finding. Political correctness is an ambiguous phrase, and people don't use it always in the same way. But we found that 3 out of 4 Americans, whether black or white, whether male or female, and actually across generations, and sometimes more than that, up into the 80 percentile, are saying that there is a problem with the way that our conversation is tending in the political space. And at the same time, those 80% of Americans say political correctness is a problem, but a majority also recognize that racism is a problem in the country. They also recognize that hate speech is a problem in this country. And so elevating the reality that Americans can tolerate the complexity that both bigotry can be a problem at the same time that there can be an excess of policing of our conversation and maybe too judgmental of an attitude of ideas that differ, that is the common experience in the United States. And that conflicting reality is one that we need to engage rather than reject. The third finding that our report introduced was the idea of core beliefs. And in short, what core beliefs means is everybody is not experiencing the same reality. And that's true on many fronts, meaning that people are experiencing their own perspective where they live and the media they consume. But specifically, our psychology differs meaningfully between those on the far left and the far right and folks in between. I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean. My co-author on the report, Dr. Daniel Yudkin, who's a social psychologist currently based at University of Pennsylvania, previously at Yale, helped us to draw from the academic literature about psychology to understand people's moral reasoning. And one of the things that we found, for instance, is that the theory of moral foundations posited by Jonathan Haidt really helps to explain why people have such differing responses to events that happen in the news. You can think of moral foundations as kind of being like moral taste buds. And some people have have a stronger sensitivity towards certain flavors than others. So in recent days, for instance, we've found that there's been an outrage over a controversial film on Netflix called Cuties, which features very young prepubescent girls who are trying to emulate the behavior of older girls in doing hip hop dancing. This is explained very well by moral foundations, because those who are most upset about it seem to be those who are more conservative. And conservatives have what's referred to in social psychology as a purity foundation, which is deeply connected to a sense of disgust. And things like young girls portrayed in a sexualized way generates a very strong sense of disgust, which those who are more liberal and more open have to a much lesser extent. Meanwhile, there's been ongoing demonstrations about the injustices suffered by people such as Breonna Taylor, who were mistreated at the hands of the police. And this is very well explained by moral foundations as well, which shows that liberals have a stronger orientation towards care, towards protecting people from harm. And they also have a very strong orientation towards fairness, the sense that people shouldn't be deprived of what belongs to them. And so it isn't just that we have different media diets, but actually that the emotions that register with us when we read the same news and see the same events will differ meaningfully based on the way that our psychology is programmed by our culture and by our genetics. And so I want to just summarize a little bit of what we found to be some of the most interesting differences between those on the left and the right. And now I am appealing to a binary description, but it's only as an instrument, which I then will try to complicate as we move forward in the conversation. So really, one way of thinking about the way that liberals and conservatives navigate the country is that we use stories. Stories are very integrated into our psychology. We are storytelling animals. And the way that we think about our political environment is also one that's deeply informed by a sense of narrative. So the older story, the one that is more oriented towards the conservative perspective, is one that treats life like a test. And it's a test of the individual. And the individual will either pass or fail this test on the basis of the degree to which they are able to cultivate good character. And good character is created through families, it's created and preserved through faith, and it is promulgated and inculcated by culture. This narrative of the individual passing a test really has deep, deep origins in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The first story of humankind is one of Adam and Eve. And what happens in the story of Adam and Eve, as you'll all be familiar, is that evil comes into the world through the form of agency. An individual choice made by Eve and then by Adam is what leads to the recognition of the nakedness, the difficulty of childbearing by women, the difficulty of plowing the fields for men. So pain and suffering and injustice come into the world through our own shortcomings as individuals. And when God banishes Adam and Eve into the world, it is with a stamp of that failure to abide by good guidance, the failure to be obedient to a code that he had laid out to them very clearly. And so the emphasis in this story is all around the individual and their choices. Now there's a newer narrative, and that narrative comes from the 19th and 20th century. And it doesn't start with the individual. It starts with the group. And it says that life is not really so much of a test. Life is more of a story. And you're born into a group, and that group lives within a story. And the story is defined by power. And so when you enter into the world, you aren't an individual agent making choices that will then compound or change the reality that you're living in. You are born as a member of a group that sits within a hierarchy of power. And the way that suffering comes into the world is through oppression and marginalization. And so this story makes a lot of sense to explain what happens in the 20th century after World War II as the women's movement and the Black civil rights movement, the LGBT movement, as they rally together to organize for more justice and better treatment and recognition of their individuality, of their dignity, of their rights. And so we see that these two narratives are operating in conflict, not at the level of the interview on TV or the level of the debate between candidates, but they're operating at a discrete level below people's psychology in priming them towards one interpretation or another. It's also leading us to have different language in our society. You might have noticed that words seem to have different meaning now. You might have noticed that there's a certain lexicon that's more common, especially on social media. Words like marginalization and structural and systemic. These are all reflections of that second narrative, and they come from a more academic and a more Marxist tradition. And the first story, which emphasizes words like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, hard work, that emphasizes individual character, this comes from an older tradition, a more Judeo-Christian tradition. And so much of what's happening in our polarized landscape is that people are using these two major stories as shortcuts to interpret complicated events. Now, it's my reading, and I would argue my organization's reading, that that's not a good thing, that we need to have complicated stories, that a single narrative arc is insufficient to capture the challenges of what we're facing today and what we face in general. So where does that leave us in this story of polarization today, where we are in the United States? Well, for comparative purposes, as Susan mentioned earlier in the call, we just concluded a 7-country comparative study where we analyzed how the United States sits in terms of its divisions and its challenges relative to 6 European countries, UK, France, Germany, Poland, Italy, and the Netherlands. Excuse me. The United States is in the worst shape of those 7 countries. So while the West in general is struggling with levels of division, debates around immigration are particularly acute, divisions around national identity are particularly relevant in many Western countries, the United States is in a particularly difficult position. It's most similar among those 7 countries to the country of Poland, where there is arguably an autocratic government coming into power now that has a lot of power over the media and where there's a lot of manipulation of the information that the Polish public are allowed to receive. We're seeing in the United States that on the Democratic side of the aisle, Democrats say that they don't want their children to marry Republicans. It's the #1 group that they don't want them to marry into. It's not others of opposite race. It's not of people of the same gender. That political division is one that people don't want to bring into their family. On the Republican side, it's also true, but there are other groups as well that Republicans have less of an appetite for. We're seeing also that there's been what we call stacking. This is really important. It used to be, and many of you will remember a time, when you could be a conservative Democrat or you could be a liberal Republican. And it used to be that both in terms of the American people and in terms of the elected officials, there was an overlap between ideology and political party, so that there was not a complete convergence where every Republican had a conservative perspective and every Democrat had a liberal perspective. That feature has now changed. So now we see that Democrats are overwhelmingly liberal, both in terms of the American people and elected officials, and Republicans are overwhelmingly conservative. There's also concern that the other party doesn't just want something different. What they want will destroy the country. And at the same time, we're seeing lower levels of trust in the government, which have been falling since the 1970s. We're seeing a general mistrust of the media. That's particularly true on the conservative side of the aisle. And while we had hoped that the pandemic might serve as a unifying force, a catalyst to bring people together around a shared interest that we don't want anyone to get sick and die, and a shared vulnerability, all of our immune systems are susceptible to the pandemic, we have not seen that the pandemic has served to bring us together. In the early months of March, April, and May, we saw people for the first time in several years report that they did feel that the country was coming back together. However, in May, particularly after the death of George Floyd, we see that people find that the divisions have gotten worse. And we're now reporting similar levels of division as we were back in 2018 and 2019. Compounding all of these challenges are systemic forces, the incentive structures of the media and the incentive structures of elected officials who need to raise a lot of money, and the incentive structures of political parties who want to hold on to power. These three institutional layers of media and politics and elected officials, media, parties, and elected officials all serve to preserve the status quo rather than to fix it. That's all the bad news. So the good news about polarization is we do recognize a lot of the same problems, regardless of where we are demographically in terms of our race and in terms of our political parties. Racism is recognized by a majority of Americans to be real and continue to be relevant. The need for stronger background checks on the acquisition of guns is widely recognized. The importance of protecting our water and our land and our air is overwhelmingly agreed upon. There's also an overwhelming consensus that there's too much money in politics and that the wealth has a distorting effect on what government does. And despite how it may seem, overwhelmingly Americans recognize that they should have gratitude for the fact that they get to live in the United States. Overwhelmingly Americans are proud to be American. And there's a lot of recognition around the there's a lot of shared recognition of the problem of our division. And 77% of Americans say that they want to move beyond this division and that they want to see compromise happen. And lastly, in a substantive way, what's encouraging is that we see that so much of the division sits at the national level. When we look closer to our communities, Americans feel more optimistic. They feel more trust in their local elected officials. They feel less animosity towards those in their communities. And we share a strong orientation towards our family roles. That's something which cuts across all groups, is that we still see so much importance in the role that we play vis-a-vis our spouse, our children, and our siblings. And those are sources of potential for organizations such as ourselves that are looking to channel things of value, perceptions that are in common, in order to advance solutions that might serve to unwind the division that we're currently seeing. Okay, so with that said, I want to move on to race. So just for context, it's been a lot this year in terms of the amount of coverage that there has been around racial injustice. And I want to just recap here some of the difficulty and some of the pain that we have seen and some of the events that have led to those things. On February 23rd this year, while jogging in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old, was killed by a man and his father for seemingly no reason other than being seen as suspicious. Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old, was killed while sleeping in her home with her boyfriend in Louisville, Kentucky on March 13th. In May 25th, George Floyd was killed while resisting arrest after the police were called concerning a $20 counterfeit bill. And perhaps most painful for many of us here in Colorado is the death of 23-year-old Elijah McClain, who was killed in Aurora via an overdose of ketamine on August 30th. And these events have led to the largest protests in American history. In 1963, at Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, he began with the words, "I'm happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation." And we've all seen the photos of the National Mall filled with people listening to Martin Luther King and others speak in 1963. It's estimated that 25,000 people attended that event. Meanwhile, in 2020, it's estimated that 25 million people took to the streets So we're seeing an enormous movement across our country of white and black people to appeal for greater justice. And the pain extends also to the families of police officers, several of whom have been shot and killed in recent months, including in recent days after the announcement that Breonna Taylor's death would not lead to the criminal indictment of officers involved. And so I think it's altogether appropriate, and certainly personally I have felt this year that it's my responsibility to take this subject matter very seriously, because there are deaths, there is the largest movement in our political history still alive today, and it's costing us lives, both of those in the streets and of our police officers. And so what I want to contribute to this conversation is something that is specific, and I'm not a legal expert. Perhaps Susan and Andrew can bring someone who is working on legislation in Colorado or in Denver to speak to bills that are being debated. I'm not a community organizer in the Black community, and perhaps such a person could explain what the Black community in Colorado could use from a group such as ourselves. I'm also not someone who's working towards criminal justice reform in the domain of incarceration. That would be a worthy voice too. But I do have expertise in perceptions and in belief and in public dialogue, and that's where I want to focus my attention today. And related to that, I think it's important to recognize what emotions we bring to this subject matter. And of course, this includes myself. At times, there's a sense of defensiveness. There's a feeling of pride that limits my ability to hear things that feel piercing, can feel accusatory. And there's also feelings of anger that can relate to shame. And then there's feelings of sorrow, genuine pain at the sadness of the events that we're seeing unfold in our country. And so I want to offer today that there are two main ways in which we need to take up this responsibility that we are rightly feeling and that has been triggered by events in 2020. And the first is to pose a question of, what if it were me? And this is a question which I think lies at the heart of one of the passages in the Bible that I most respect and most agree with, I guess you could say. And that is where Jesus says, in response to a question about what the greatest commandment is, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And this is the part where it confused me when I read this passage when I was a teenager and struggled with it, because it concludes with, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And that love your neighbor as yourself, I think, is the formulation that I want to focus on today, because I think it captures so much of what it means to hold humility and empathy in this moment vis-a-vis the subject of race and injustice in our country. And so I think it's our obligation to listen. And so what this means is reducing our pride, not having an ego, and being willing to listen to the perspectives of those who are different from you, especially in this case, listening to Black Americans. And if you listen to Black Americans on this subject, these are some of the things that you learn. These are things that I have learned in recent months. First, 90% of Black Americans think that racism remains a significant issue in this country. And it doesn't matter which political party they belong to. It doesn't matter their generation. It doesn't matter their gender. It doesn't matter any feature about who they are. Race feels very salient, very relevant, and very problematic, overwhelmingly among Black Americans. And sadly, it's an experience not just of relevance, but of lack of optimism, even a pessimistic discouragement and despair. Only 31% of Black Americans think that we're close to achieving Dr. Martin Luther King's dream, as he explained almost 60 years ago on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. We asked in a recent survey about 7 different types of mistreatment that Black Americans may or may not face. And the number one, most commonly recognized by about 80% of Black Americans, was police mistreatment. And the way that that sounds in people's own words, there's an African-American woman who has joined one of our daily conversations who says, the entire situation with the unfortunate murder of Mr. Floyd brought back so many fears that I have as the mother of a young Black man and a young Black woman, and also a lot of experiences that I've had. I have two uncles who are on the police force, and death by cop is a thing. As a mother, she was relaying the degree to which this fills her with anxiety, that her children aren't safe from the people that are intended to protect her. I also want to read a little bit of some research that was conducted by an economist at Harvard. His name's Roland Fryer. At 30 years old, he became the youngest African-American to be given tenure at Harvard. And he found, by studying police records extensively, that Black Americans are more likely to be handcuffed, more likely to be pushed up against a wall and treated with weapons drawn. Black people are disproportionately more likely to be pulled over for drug searches. And interestingly, he found that the likelihood of Black people being pulled over by police officers drops when it comes to nighttime, because after dusk, police officers can't identify the race of a driver, making it all the more clear that race is relevant in the way that the police are treating them. Black people are also more likely to be verbally abused by police during these interactions. But here's where the complexity comes in. So according to Roland Fryer, contrary to his expectations, he found that while white men are actually more likely to be killed by police officers in a police encounter. And that was a big shock to him, because Roland Fryer, like most of us, are familiar with the story of Black person killed at the police officer's hands, being told over and over and over again. But he found in his research that not only, of course, are white people killed by police officers at a higher number than Black Americans are, but if you look within police encounters, the frequency of a police encounter leading to death, when you control for frequency of those encounters, is actually higher among white Americans than among Black Americans. And so we see a confusing not a confusing picture, but a subtle picture, one where Black Americans are more likely to get pulled over and mistreated, manhandled, and abused, but actually the notion that Black Americans are disproportionately killed at a higher rate by police officers actually does not bear out with the data. And so the way this relates to the injunction to love your neighbor as yourself is that I want to reverse that framing a little bit. Rather than love your neighbor as yourself, what about loving yourself as much as you love your neighbor? And so I feel there are two risks with the subject matter of race. There's the lack of empathy, which can lead people to perpetuate racism and mistreatment and not to recognize the difficulty and pain. But there's also the possibility of not being empathetic enough to ourselves, to taking on too much guilt and too much shame. I want to, as a thought experiment, pose a question. To what extent would you hold a child responsible for his father's crime, or a daughter responsible for her grandfather's crime? Hopefully not to any extent. And to what extent might you blame every Afghan, for instance, for the attacks of Al-Qaeda? Probably to no extent. The idea of collective blame or blaming previous generations for an individual's mistake or error is one that we don't embrace. But in our desire to be empathetic in conversations such as this one, we can sometimes, I believe, make the mistake of applying a degree of accountability to ourselves, of guilt and of shame, and taking on responsibility that perhaps doesn't fairly apply to us. And the danger here is that it can conceal from us some of the realities and the complexities of the situation that we're facing. If we only have a willingness to place responsibility in one direction, we can sometimes fail to see or be willing to look at some of the complexities of what's actually happening in our country. And so that brings me to the second injunction. So if the first is, what if it were me? The second is, how do I know? And I don't think this is our obligation so much as people of faith, so much as I think this is an obligation of us as citizens. And so as citizens, we get information, perhaps more now than at any point in American history, that can be conflicting, confusing, and overwhelming. And it's an obligation, I believe, of each of us to take that information and take seriously the task of sorting through it and not just revert to an ideological story which fits our preferences. And this can be uncomfortable. I want to take one example of the complexity of information that I think we're encountering and how we should deal with it. So many of you will have heard the phrase, hands up, don't shoot. And hands up, don't shoot comes from a particular incident of the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The story was that Michael Brown had his hands elevated, he was on his knees, and a police officer shot him in the head. This is a story that was told by neighbors, and this became the popular narrative in the press. You'll still see Michael Brown's name mentioned among victims of police brutality. And this led to the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement today, and continues to be a refrain in protests today of hands up, don't shoot. The Department of Justice under Barack Obama investigated the incident that happened, the death of Michael Brown, and what happened with Derek Wilson, the officer involved there. And what they found was discouraging on two fronts. On the first front was that the police force in Ferguson was indeed pulling over police officers overwhelmingly at a higher rate. Police officers were pulling over African Americans at overwhelmingly higher rates than they were pulling over white officers. They were abusing them verbally. They were tasing Black prisoners who were already in jail. They were terrifying them with dogs. And there were abuses beyond this that were delineated in incredible detail by the Department of Justice. But the same Department of Justice conducting that report found that the story of Michael Brown's killing with his hands in the air was in fact a myth, a dangerous myth, because in reality, Michael Brown was a very large man, over 6 feet tall, much larger than the police officer, had wrestled with the police officer who was in his vehicle, had tried to take away the gun, and in fact had managed to discharge the police officer's gun while the police officer was still in the car. And at the time when Michael Brown was killed, he was charging the police officer with the intent of taking the gun from him. And so the story of hands up, don't shoot has a mythical beginning that we need to not perpetuate, because I do not believe it is responsible for us to extend and perpetuate a narrative of injustice that is either exaggerated or drawn from wholesale dishonesty about the events that happened. And it's only by dealing with the details that we can draw out these sort of distinctions and fulfill what I think is our responsibility as citizens to understand the issues that we are confronting. Okay, I'm now going to move to my conclusion. So here's where we fit in. The good news is, more in common, although we're a small organization, we are not just we are one of an entire network of organizations that are working on the problem of polarization in our society. There are a whole sector of organizations who are working on understanding divisions, providing better information to the American people, growing commonality. And so I'm going to name some of the other organizations that I have contact with or that are operating in our sector that you might want to explore further to understand how this work is being carried out in the United States today. And so the first is Braver Angels, formerly Better Angels, that brings people together around dinners. Over Zero is a great organization that conducts research to try and mitigate violence around elections. One America movement is trying to restore a sense of American identity across lines of difference. E Pluribus Unum out of Louisiana is working to address the legacy of racism in the South. Beyond Conflict is partnered with academic professors and researchers to conduct leading research on the psychology of polarization. Othering and Belonging, led by John Powell out of California, is doing great work in convening organizations to help improve our society and make it one where everyone feels that they belong. So there are 4 ways that I think we can play a role here. The first is through donations. If we find an organization that really has, of course, a mission that we support, we can support it financially. The organization I would highlight, if I can just pick one for now, is the Equal Justice Initiative by Bryan Stevenson. If you don't know of his work, go out and read Just Mercy or watch the movie that was released recently about his life. I think Bryan Stevenson's one of the most exemplary Americans alive today, working on problems of racial injustice in the legal system in the South. The second thing is to share positive stories on social media if you're on social media. The social media companies have learned that the most shareable stories are the ones that are the most aggravating. They're the ones that are most, generate the most indignation. And so we can serve as an end to that cycle of generating outrage by sharing stories that show progress rather than that show polarization. And finally, we have what we can do in our everyday behaviors beyond these two things is we can consume a media diet that's not just from one source or another. I challenge myself to do this. I could do it better, but just reading the New York Times or just watching Fox News or just reading from one particular source can give us a really imbalanced sense of some of the things that are happening in our country. I would avoid politics on social media altogether. I don't think the discussions there are productive. Conversations about politics, I think, work best in small groups and in person. And if you can't do in person because of COVID, over the phone is almost as good. And my final thought is this. I think the United States is at a crossroads because we're currently building towards two futures at the same time. In the first future that we're building together, we are converging. Under better times, international travel is abounding. We have a shared cultural literacy across countries that is emerging. We have the capacity to communicate increasingly in the same language. Poverty and hunger have fallen off a cliff during our lifetimes. And the Millennial Development Goals that sought to reduce the worst outcomes in disease and hunger have largely been met. We are in the trajectory where we will have fewer and fewer developing countries over time. Our life expectancy is growing. Democracies have proliferated to nearly every country in the globe. Information is free and nearly universally accessible. And the future is exciting. Autonomous vehicles, being able to print your own goods from home with a 3D printer, age extending and personalized medicines, private space travel, the future can be very exciting. But we're also, at the same time, working towards a much worse future. We're floundering. Our climate is causing droughts and competitions for resources that are triggering waves of migration. And the developed world is struggling to absorb those migrants, leading to populist and fringe parties gaining power. Our fractured societies are struggling to redistribute increasingly concentrated wealth, leading to an increase of revolutionary fervor in our populations. And all of these distractions at home keep us from organizing the solutions that we need to the biggest problems that our global community faces, of rising sea levels, of cyber attacks on internet and electricity grids, and the ominous threat of nuclear war. And so, which one of these futures will win out? Well, I believe that the answer lies with us. Can we, as ordinary people, adhere to a commitment of the conscience and of the mind and empower others who will do the same? Can we forge an identity not out of biology or out of party or even out of nation, but on the basis of a culture where we build together around shared values of humility and empathy and responsibility?
Thank you, Stephen Hawkins for president. You are awesome. Thank you. That's going to have to say it all, Stephen, because words just don't capture the stunning breadth and scope and depth of your work and your ability to share it. Thank you. I do want to let you know that I'm going to suggest to the group, probably by email, that we turn our attention next to the movie Just Mercy. It's incredible. It's incredible. And Bryan Stevenson's work is incredible. Are you ready to take some questions or comments from the group?
I am, and I'm sure that the group is ready to ask them after taking far more than my allotted time, and I apologize for that.
Not at all. You don't need to apologize. Speaking for myself only, I found it fascinating and well worth my listening. So thank you again. Would you please, if you'd like to speak, raise a hand. I will jot down about 5 or 6 names and then call on you in order. So if you'd raise your hand and keep it up, that will be really helpful. I am just scanning the... Okay, Becky is first. Who after Becky? Then Karen Maddock. I'm surfing between a couple of screens, so anyone else? Shall I just start with those 2, and then if more folks, okay. Mike Simpson is third, and okay, I'm just going to go with those 3. That's what I see, and then we'll you can sorry, Eben Carsey is number 4. All right, let's just pause there, and when we get to Eben, we'll take a new round. So Becky, please, it's yours.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. It was fascinating. I just was curious if you could share with us the research study that you referenced from the